For more on the turmoil in Iraq, we're joined by PJ Crowley. He's a professor at George Washington University's Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. You also probably recognize him. He was at the State Department, a familiar face from 2009 to 2011. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Mike.
Back in March, Fuad Hussein, who was the chief of staff of the Kurdistan president, warned that Iraq was on the verge of becoming a failed state. Today, he was at an event here in Washington. This is how he described things. He said, Kurdistan now shares a border with a terrorist nation. He says the Islamic State is a threat not only to Kurdistan, it's a threat to Baghdad, Iran, Turkey, Jordan, the entire region. So I guess my question is, why weren't people listening to him back in March? How did we get to where we are today? And can this thing be stitched back together again?
Well, it can be stitched back together again, but there's a window of opportunity that's not going to stay open for that long. And I think what the United States is looking at is at least a disappointing first week or two in terms of the latest version of the crisis and the Iraqi political response. Part of the dynamic, part of the reason why the Islamic State, as they now call themselves, have been able to gain a toehold in Iraq is because the people in these Sunni-dominated provinces fear the Shiite-led government more than they fear ISIS. That has to change, but in order for that to change, the approach to governance in Iraq has to change, a much more inclusive government, including a meaningful role of Sunnis than Maliki has shown over the last 4 to 8 years. But as we've seen so far, the Iraqi parliament is squabbling, but hasn't really necessarily been able to form the kind of government of national unity that's needed in this crisis.
But if people were warning months and months ago that this could happen, shouldn't there have been action taken from the international community to address it beforehand?
Well, the international community over the past decade has given the Iraqis the tools to govern themselves. Iraqis have significant resources. I don't agree that Iraq is a failed state. It has all the ingredients it needs to govern. What it's never had is that political unity. We've seen, the sectarian divide that has fractured Iraq before and is now threatening Iraq again. So, in a sense, this dynamic is not new. We've been experiencing for the last 5 or 10 years. But to be honest, Iraq is not necessarily stepping up to the challenge in the way that you'd like.
Let me talk to you about the more worrisome aspect. There's been reports 80% of the military collapsed. And what we know about that is there's a lot of U.S. hardware there, military assets, now in the hands of a very dangerous group. I talked about the threat to the region. How do you see it as a threat?
Well, I mean, the bad news is, yes, they're acquiring real capability. They're acquiring millions, if not billions, in assets, and that can go a long way to fuel the insurgency. The positive element is that we already have seen this cycle through Iraq once before with al-Qaeda in Iraq. ISIS is now a different version of that same virulent kind of movement. They didn't have staying power before. Ultimately, the Sunni tribesmen working with the U.S. military at the time was able to push them, to push them off. They're not necessarily, they don't offer a vision of hope that most Iraqis want to see. So one would hope that they will overstay their welcome this time just as last, but that again depends on meaningful steps by the central government in Baghdad. If they find a way to bring the Sunnis and Kurds into a more meaningful role in government and a fair share of the revenue that does exist in Iraq, that Iraq could turn one way. If we have more of the same, is the real possibility that Iraq will fracture into 3 separate states.
No one wants to see that, I'm sure. PJ Crowley, thank you so much for coming in.